Hi everyone, and welcome to this next bite-sized training session for the gas membrane installation NVQ level 2. I'm Neil Selvage and welcome on board for this continuation of our journey through the occupational standards. So tonight we're continuing with the National Occupational Standards. We're still in the 612 preparing to install unit, which is maintaining safe working practices. So as you can see, a lot of these standards are very geared about the health and safety elements in this planning before we start work. So that's where we're going to take this journey today. So if I bring up the standard, the National Occupational Standards that we've been doing all the way through these bite-sized trainings, and the first two that we've got is quite a small unit, this one actually. So maintain safe working practices when preparing to install. Subunits 1 and 2 there are both PPE related, so we're going to use and explain. So often this is carried out while learners are preparing to go on site. Have they got the right things, the PPE that they need and that's specified? So if we have a look at the next element of the PPE, there's multitudes of items that we can use. And I must emphasize here that the PPE is our last line of defense in our hierarchy of controls. So just be mindful of that. But also specific items of PPE will be identified in your risk assessments, through your method statements, and even in your COSH risk assessments as well. If you're using products where certain gloves or eye protection or covering, overalls or protective boots might be required, must consider that and also review it before you start work. So this is a key element of our 612 in preparing to install gas membranes. When we look at specific elements of PPE, boots is a common one that we have to wear on site. Understanding the different elements of the boots, so we can see here we've got an S3 coding against here for a Wellington, which is an S5. So if you look at the codings, and these are available on most manufacturers and suppliers' websites, they will break down how the codings relate to different elements. So the toe cap rating, the fuel oil resistance or anti-static sole compliance. And just looking through those, it's worth considering that your boots are the right type as specified by your employer and what's provided by your employer. So always be mindful of that element in looking at your PPE and its codings. And you will see these International Standards Organization, ISO, have codings for all products which are related. And likewise, using our gloves, the codings that are on our hand protection. So here we've got a pretty general looking pair of gloves, but we can see there's different codings that are visible for the abrasion, cut, tear and puncture resistance. So obviously the lower the number, the least resistance it has. So I just took two comparison ones there so you can just see the difference of the product and the codings for gloves, for example. So if you're using chemical resistant gloves, you will see a different coding again for that. Okay. Now, using your PPE and maintaining it is quite an important part. We will look at, storing it. Either you're going to use the workshop facility or the site facilities with the drying room. Here we can see some lockers and a nice changing room, drying room area. Or you might be storing it in your van if you're going from job to job. But how do you look after it? Yeah, you must store it and keep it in a good condition. And as we can see, the two examples there on the right show a pretty poor state of affairs with PPE. What should you do in that situation? Your employer gives you PPE that you use it in accordance to what it's required to do, and you also maintain it and look after it. So you have a duty to report if there's a problem, starts failing, you let your employer know. They might instruct you either to go and purchase a new one, or they might supply you from their stock. So just be mindful of that. Now, when we look at the last unit, point 3 on this, state how emergencies should be responded. So we've kind of covered this earlier on with a little bit of first aid, but it crops up again here. One of the things we look at, and this is a good old CSCS question, is about fire extinguishers and procedures. A lot of the work you're doing, do you have elements of your work which could create a fire? Do you keep a fire extinguisher on your van? What type of fire extinguisher? Do you know how to respond? Does your risk assessment highlight the protocols for dealing with a fire, or are you working to what the site tells you when you do your induction? So if a fire, if you have to sound the alarm, how do you evacuate? How do you report or respond to an assembly point? And what's the protocols that you should do? But the other thing is, and I often ask this to learners, if you keep a fire extinguisher in your van, are you trained to use it? Because it's all well and good having a fire extinguisher, but is it the right type? And we can see here we've got different color bands for different products that are in there, which will fight different fires. But CO2 is a common one which I raise concerns about if you're working in an enclosed space, for example, because CO2 is one of the gases we're dealing with in the ground. What could the effects be if you discharge that fire extinguisher in a confined space for an electrical fire, which it's appropriate for? What could the consequences be? So be mindful of that. And here we can see somebody getting some training on using the correct fire extinguisher in the right environment and knowing how to tackle the fire. My word of advice is, if you're not trained to fight a fire, you do not attempt to. Here we can see a spillage situation. Now, if you spill small amounts of product, you should still follow full procedures of mopping it up, cleaning it, retaining it, reporting it. That's the important thing. You must let people know that that has been spilled, because we can see an environment here, it's going to seep into the ground. There could be a natural water course under there. The water table could be quite high. Any contaminants that you drop into that could eventually get into the wider environment and cause pollution control problems, and might even be traced by a local authority, water board. So just be mindful of that and have plans in place of how you're going to deal with it, again, through your risk assessment and your methods of work. And as we covered in a previous unit, first aid, understanding how you're going to deal with that is quite a key element. You could be working with a colleague who could collapse. What are you going to do? How do you respond? Have you received any initial any first aid training, first response training, to know the basics of safe ways of dealing with an emergency like a first aid problem? So just be mindful of that and consider that, because it will be asked during your assessment. Then we've got more gas specific elements here. So we can see we've got a technician working in a confined space there down in a duct. And on the right, we can see a personal gas monitor or personal, environment monitor there, detecting various gases. And we've got the compliance with the Dangerous Substances and Explosive Atmospheres regulations, DSEAR, where we might have to consider that if there is a lot of methane in the ground, or there's areas which are very limited on their ventilation, which you might have to work in, i.e. basements, lift shafts, bottom of stairwells. These are things you need to be thinking about as you need to be reviewing your method statement and risk assessment to how your employer approaches this. Are you trained to use this equipment? So confined space training is quite a key element if you are encroaching in certain spaces. So again, that was just a bite-sized insight into what is expected of you as you go through your NVQ level 2. We've got a couple more sections coming up in the next few weeks, so hopefully this is proving useful for you. I actually met some learners last week who had been looking through the units, and they gave me some good feedback, which is positive. But by all means, any questions, any comments, please let me know. And here's all my usual details to contact me. And I really appreciate everybody tuning in and looking at these. Really welcome your comments, but by all means, I'm here and welcome any feedback at all. So in the meantime, look after yourselves, and hopefully I'll see you all around next week for our continuation of the bite-sized units. Okay, good to see you. Thanks again. Bye.